He was the untouchable architect of the British monarchy, dictating moral purity to an entire empire. Yet behind palace doors, Reginald Brett hid the most twisted psychological incest secret of his era. Viscount Esher didn't just manipulate kings, he weaponized his power to consume the intimate life of his own son. The turn of the 20th century was a period of profound transition for the British Empire. Queen Victoria's long, rigidly structured reign was drawing to a close, giving way to the Edwardian era. It was a time marked by immense global power, strictly enforced social hierarchies, and a deep, unspoken hypocrisy prevalent among the ruling class. The public demanded flawless leaders. The institution of the monarchy needed to appear immaculate to maintain its authority over millions of subjects across the globe. But behind the awe-inspiring grandeur of the throne, the empire required managers, fixers, and strategists. It was an era where true power did not always reside with the individual wearing the crown, but rather with the person whispering carefully crafted advice into the sovereign's ear. And in the highest echelons of British society, no one whispered with more calculated authority than Reginald Brett. Born in 1852 into a life of significant privilege, Reginald Brett was molded by the most prestigious institutions available to the British aristocracy. He was educated at Eton College and later at Trinity College, Cambridge. During these formative years, he displayed a brilliant, highly analytical mind and an uncanny, almost predatory ability to read the desires and weaknesses of other people. But unlike his aristocratic peers, who aggressively sought public adulation, parliamentary glory, and their names in the daily papers, Esher realized something profound early in his career. He understood that visibility is a vulnerability. His rise to influence was quiet, deliberate, and absolute. Rather than fighting political battles in the House of Commons, he became an indispensable friend and private advisor to King Edward VII and subsequently to King George V. His influence grew to be so pervasive that the government formally offered him the position of Secretary of State for War. He declined without hesitation. Later, he was offered the role of Viceroy of India, perhaps the most prestigious and powerful colonial posting in the entire world, representing the absolute peak of a Victorian gentleman's career. Again, he declined. Historical analysts often point to these refusals as the clearest evidence of his overarching strategy. Why would a man turn down the chance to rule the jewel of the British Empire? Because Esher understood that formal office inevitably brought intense public and parliamentary scrutiny. By remaining a royal courtier, serving on various obscure but vital committees, and holding the ceremonial title of Deputy Constable of Windsor Castle, he retained unparalleled access to the monarchy without the heavy burden of public accountability. He became the ultimate power behind the throne. From the quiet comfort of his private study, he manipulated political appointments, influenced military strategies, and drafted royal decrees. He was the architect of the system, yet he stood entirely outside its structural limitations. While Esher's public life was steadfastly dedicated to maintaining the imperial facade and ensuring the monarchy appeared unblemished, his private life was a labyrinth of hidden desires. Many historians note that Esher was a man deeply driven by what was then euphemistically referred to in aristocratic circles as Greek love. However, unlike other upper-class men of his time who frequented underground clubs or sought discreet, often transactional encounters with working-class men, Esher's pursuits were characterized by an unsettling arrogance and a profound need for absolute control. Records indicate he was not interested in relationships with grown men, those who would be his equals in society or intellect. Instead, his attention was intensely and exclusively focused on youth. He found his sanctuary not in the hidden shadows of London's nightlife, but within the walls of the most elite educational institution in the country, Eton College. Under the carefully maintained guise of his royal authority and his self-appointed role as a scout for future imperial talent, Esher essentially made Eton his private domain. He frequently visited the school, enjoying unfettered access to the brightest, most prominent young boys of the British aristocracy. He cultivated close friendships with them, positioning himself as a benevolent mentor and a wise confidant. He offered them glimpses into the halls of power, a deeply intoxicating prospect for young men being groomed to inherit the empire. Because of his immense, shadowy power and his direct connection to the king, no headmaster, no teacher, and certainly no parent dared to question his constant presence at the school. He was the man who held the secrets of the nation. Challenging his motives was practically unthinkable and potentially career-ending. In this closed, highly privileged environment, Esher operated with complete impunity. He drew young men into his orbit through a calculated mix of intellectual flattery, promised patronage, and deep psychological dominance. He recognized that these boys, separated from their families and living in a rigid hierarchy, were uniquely vulnerable to the attention of a powerful older man who seemed to genuinely value their thoughts and ambitions. The true scope of his activities at Eton remains a subject of historical debate, but the psychological implications are clear. He utilized his status to bypass the standard moral safeguards of his era. He was not merely a visitor, he was a silent force, shaping the emotional landscapes of boys who would go on to become prime ministers, generals, and colonial governors. The contradiction is stark. Here was the man trusted to ensure the moral purity of the royal family, freely indulging in complex, emotionally manipulative relationships with minors under the protective umbrella of his own unassailable authority. He had built a fortress around himself, constructed from the very societal rules he routinely violated. The deepest and most unsettling chapter of Viscount Esher's life, however, does not merely involve the hallowed halls of Eton College. The most profound complexities of his character are found closer to home, hidden within the very walls of his own domestic life. To the outside world, the Brett family represented the absolute pinnacle of Edwardian respectability. Esher had married Eleanor van der Weyer, the daughter of a prominent Belgian diplomat. It was a union that provided him with wealth, elevated social standing, and, crucially, an unassailable cover of aristocratic normalcy. Together they had 4 children. Eleanor served as the perfect societal ornament, a devoted wife who managed his sprawling estates and hosted his politically vital gatherings at their country home, Orchard Lea. She functioned as the ultimate shield. By all public accounts, Esher was a dutiful husband and a loving, engaged father. He projected the image of a man whose moral compass was perfectly aligned with the rigid Christian values he so often championed to the king. Yet, when historians examine the private archives and personal correspondences left behind, a vastly different and deeply troubling reality emerges. the facade of the perfect Edwardian father begins to fracture, revealing a psychological landscape that challenges every conventional boundary of family duty. This is most starkly evident in his relationship with his second son, Maurice Brett, whom the family affectionately called by the nickname Molly. It is within this specific father-son dynamic that researchers find the most controversial and dark aspects of Esher's hidden life. The relationship between Reginald Brett and his son Maurice crossed emotional and psychological boundaries that completely defied the strict moral codes of the era. It is important to note that most historians and biographers agree there is no definitive, concrete evidence of any direct physical misconduct between the father and his son. However, the absence of such actions does not lessen the severity of the situation. What historical records do reveal is a profound, almost suffocating level of undue influence. Esher appeared to systematically dismantle the traditional boundaries of paternal guidance, replacing them with a complex web of control and unhealthy projection. Many historians argue that Esher, constrained by the immense pressure of his public role and the need to maintain his immaculate reputation, utilized his own son as a living instrument to explore the hidden social spheres he himself avoided. He recognized that Maurice, growing up in the shadow of an overwhelmingly powerful father, was highly susceptible to his influence. Rather than protecting his son from the complexities of the adult world, Esher actively pushed him toward them. Relying on his supreme authority as the patriarch, he relentlessly encouraged Maurice to step into the clandestine circles of London society. Specifically, he pushed the young man to engage in highly secretive social networks involving military and aristocratic peers. This was not the act of a modern liberal parent offering acceptance. It was a deeply calculated form of control. According to numerous historical accounts, Esher's involvement did not end with mere encouragement. He demanded to be a part of these experiences. Surviving letters reveal an intense, extreme micromanagement of his personal life that is difficult to comprehend even by today's standards. After Maurice would return from his social engagements, Esher required his son to write to him. He demanded extensive, detailed accounts of the interactions. He wanted to know the specific gestures, the words spoken, and the emotional nuances of his son's private affairs. It was a staggering abuse of parental trust. The man who advised the King of England on matters of state security and national morality was sitting in his private study, eagerly consuming the intimate confessions of his own child. Researchers suggest that by reading these letters, Esher was able to experience the thrill of the forbidden without ever exposing himself to the risk of public ruin. He lived out his own suppressed cravings through the physical experiences of his son. He remained the unseen architect, pulling the strings of Maurice's emotional life just as efficiently as he pulled the political strings at Buckingham Palace. The language found within these surviving letters provides the most damning evidence of this psychological overreach. The words Esher used to address his son go far beyond the boundaries of standard paternal affection. Even when accounting for the naturally more flowery and emotionally expressive writing style of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, the tone remains shocking. In these private documents, a powerful father addresses his son using the vocabulary of a desperate lover. He frequently referred to Maurice using highly charged titles, calling him his best beloved. In some passages, he wrote openly of his desperate love for the young man. This linguistic intensity has been the subject of considerable historical debate. Some scholars caution against viewing the past through a modern lens, arguing that romanticized language between male family members was not entirely uncommon in the 19th century. However, a significant number of historians point to the context of these letters, the specific demands for intimate details regarding Maurice's encounters with other men, as evidence that this was not merely a stylistic quirk. It was an extreme form of emotional enmeshment. Esher had managed to weave his own identity so tightly into his son's that the lines between them blurred completely. He transformed a young man's life into a carefully managed theater production, designed solely to serve the hidden ego of the man behind the throne. The ultimate tragedy of this situation lies in the sheer power imbalance. Maurice Brett was not navigating the world as an independent adult making his own choices. He was operating under the intense gravitational pull of one of the most manipulative figures in the British Empire. Esher did not need to use threats or physical force to control his family. His power was atmospheric. It was absolute. He had created an environment where his desires became the organizing principle of his son's existence. In doing so, he committed a profound betrayal of the natural order of the family unit, sacrificing his son's psychological autonomy on the altar of his own unfulfilled obsessions. The profound tragedy of Viscount Esher's private life naturally leads to the most perplexing question of his entire existence. How did a man so deeply compromised survive an era famous for its brutal destruction of those who strayed from the moral path? The late Victorian and Edwardian periods were notoriously unforgiving. This was the same society that had recently thrown Oscar Wilde into a prison cell to be broken by hard labor for his private affairs. It was the same establishment that would later force men like Lord Beauchamp into humiliating permanent exile to avoid a public scandal. Men of high birth and vast wealth were routinely ruined, stripped of their titles, and banished from polite society the moment their private transgressions became public knowledge. Yet Reginald Brett remained entirely untouched. He was never blackmailed. He was never threatened with police action. He never faced the cold, unforgiving judgment of a courtroom. He survived and indeed flourished because of a singular, terrifying reality. He did not merely operate within the British establishment. He was the establishment. Esher had meticulously constructed a position of such indispensable value to the monarchy and the government that to destroy him would be to threaten the structural integrity of the empire itself. He had mastered the ultimate mechanism of survival, which is to make oneself the keeper of everyone else's secrets. By embedding himself so deeply into the administrative machinery of the state, he ensured that his own downfall would trigger a catastrophic collapse of the political elite. This dynamic becomes most apparent when we examine his relationship with King George V. When George ascended to the throne in 1910, he inherited an empire at the absolute peak of its territorial expansion, but one facing profound internal and external pressures. The political landscape of Europe was growing increasingly volatile. Revolutionary ideas were beginning to threaten ancient monarchies across the continent. The British monarchy desperately needed to fortify its position, not through military might, but through moral authority. King George V was acutely aware that the survival of the Windsor dynasty depended entirely on the public perceiving the royal family as the ultimate embodiment of duty, respectability, and flawless Christian virtue. King George, however, was a traditional, somewhat unimaginative man. He was a naval officer by training, deeply dedicated to his country, but he lacked the political cunning and the philosophical depth required to navigate the complex public relations challenges of the modern age. He needed a guide. He needed an architect to design the royal image. He turned to the one man who had intimately served his father, King Edward VII, and who understood the precise mechanics of public perception, Viscount Esher. It is here that the staggering hypocrisy of Esher's life reaches its absolute zenith. The man who spent his private hours reading intimately detailed accounts of his son's clandestine affairs with young soldiers was the very same man sitting in the drawing rooms of Buckingham Palace, sternly advising the king on the necessity of moral purity. Esher became the self-appointed guardian of the royal conscience. He drafted memorandums, offered daily counsel, and orchestrated a massive silent campaign to ensure the king and Queen Mary appeared as the perfect, unblemished parents of the British nation. Historical records show that Esher actively guided the monarchy to distance itself from the lavish, morally ambiguous, and often scandalous lifestyle that had characterized the previous reign of Edward VII. He understood that the working classes of Britain, who were increasingly demanding political rights and better living conditions, would no longer tolerate a monarchy that lived in blatant decadence. Esher instructed King George to embrace a life of visible austerity, strict familial devotion, and unwavering public rectitude. He effectively wrote the script for the modern British monarchy, a script based on duty and spotless moral character. The audacity of this double life is chilling. Esher was dictating the moral standards for an empire covering a quarter of the globe, while simultaneously operating a private realm built on psychological manipulation and the exploitation of youth. He had compartmentalized his existence with the cold precision of a surgeon. In his mind, there was the realm of the state, which required absolute order and traditional morality to function, and there was his own private realm, where he was the absolute sovereign, exempt from the laws he helped enforce upon millions. This exemption was maintained through his iron grip on information. Esher was not merely a courtier, he was the archivist of power. He was appointed to edit the vast collection of Queen Victoria's private letters and journals. This position granted him the extraordinary power to curate history. He decided which letters the public would see and which historical truths would be permanently buried in the royal vaults. He knew precisely where the bodies were buried because in many cases he held the shovel. Politicians and aristocrats were fully aware that Esher possessed intimate knowledge of their own private failures and political miscalculations. To challenge his authority or to investigate his frequent questionable visits to the dormitories of Eton College would invite swift and absolute retaliation. Therefore, the system protected him. The British ruling class operated on an unspoken code of omerta. As long as the public facade was rigorously maintained, the private transgressions of the truly powerful were met with a wall of orchestrated silence. Esher's life exposes the dark, functional utility of this hypocrisy. The establishment did not care about true morality. It cared about the appearance of morality. They needed Esher's brilliant, strategic mind to keep the ship of state afloat and the monarchy secure. In exchange for his services, they granted him a silent, unlimited indulgence to rule his own private, shadowed world exactly as he saw fit. The human cost of this arrangement was entirely borne by those caught in his web. While Esher enjoyed the prestige of royal favor and the comforts of his sprawling estates, the young men he manipulated at Eton were left to navigate the emotional wreckage of his attention, and his son Maurice remained forever tethered to the overwhelming psychological demands of a father who viewed him not as an independent soul, but as a vessel for his own suppressed existence. This is the true nature of unaccountable power. It does not merely govern nations, it consumes the people closest to it, leaving behind a legacy that tastes of profound injustice and looks to the outside world like absolute perfection. Beyond the drawing rooms of Buckingham Palace and the dormitories of Eton, the true scope of Viscount Esher's influence extended directly into the war machine of the British Empire. In 1904, Esher secured a position of monumental yet largely unseen power. He became a leading permanent member of the Committee of Imperial Defense. This was the highly secretive body responsible for preparing the entire British military apparatus for future global conflicts. It was a role of supreme national security. Yet, for a man like Esher, it also served a secondary, deeply personal function. It provided him with the perfect mechanism to expand his private network of influence on a national scale. He used his unparalleled authority to completely reorganize the War Office. In doing so, he gained the de facto power to control military appointments and promotions. This is where his public duty and his private compulsions merged in a deeply unsettling manner. Several historians point out that Esher deliberately placed his favored young men, those he had carefully cultivated at Eton or through his son's social circles, into strategic military and administrative positions. He was not merely collecting emotional experiences, he was actively building a shadow government. He surrounded himself with a cadre of loyal, indebted young officers who owe their careers, their status, and their futures entirely to him. This was manipulation executed on an industrial scale. Esher possessed a cold, clinical understanding of human nature. He recognized that ambition is just as powerful a vulnerability as youth. By holding the keys to promotion within the British Army, he ensured absolute loyalty from his targets. These young men were bound to him. They were trapped in a complex web of aristocratic patronage. If they pleased the Viscount, if they submitted to his emotional demands, their careers soared. If they defied him or sought independence, their prospects vanished overnight. It was a system that operated entirely outside the bounds of democratic oversight or military protocol. He was an unelected official, accountable to no one but the king, using the vast apparatus of the state to satisfy his need for absolute dominance over the next generation of leaders. The primary tool of this dominance was the pen. In the Edwardian era, before the advent of instant communication correspondence, was the absolute lifeblood of power. Esher was an obsessively prolific writer. He wrote thousands upon thousands of letters. But his letters were not mere communication. They were precision instruments of psychological control. When writing to military generals or cabinet ministers, his prose was cold, calculating, and ruthlessly logical. Yet when writing to his chosen young men, and particularly to his son Maurice, his tone shifted entirely. It became feverish. It became demanding and emotionally exhausting. He weaponized affection. He used extravagant praise to elevate his targets, making them feel like the most vital individuals in the entire empire. Then, with devastating precision, he would use silence, withdrawal, or subtle criticism to plunge them into deep anxiety. This calculated push and pull created a powerful trauma bond. The young men caught in his orbit became desperate for his approval. They sought his validation above all else. This psychological tactic is well documented by modern researchers studying coercive control. Esher instinctively understood how to slowly break down the psychological defenses of those around him, replacing their autonomous will with his own overarching desires. Nowhere was this emotional devastation more evident than in the continuing life of Maurice Brett. The historical record leaves us to piece together the internal reality of a son trapped in an impossible position. Maurice was an officer in the military. He was expected by society to embody the rugged, independent, and stoic ideals of British masculinity. Yet, behind closed doors, he was reduced to a compliant narrator of his own private life, forced to continuously feed his father's voyeuristic demands. How does a young man survive such an extreme psychological contradiction? Many researchers suggest that Maurice suffered profound and lasting emotional consequences. To constantly perform for a father who demands the intimate, raw details of your romantic life creates an inescapable mental prison. Maurice could never truly own his experiences. Every relationship, every secret encounter, every moment of vulnerability was ultimately co-opted by the man sitting in the shadows of Windsor Castle. Esher did not just steal his son's privacy, he systematically stole his son's ability to experience independent intimacy. The son was molded into a permanent living extension of the father's ego. As the years progressed, the shadow of a much larger global tragedy began to loom over Europe. The world was marching steadily toward the cataclysm of the First World War. Esher, through his role on the Committee of Imperial Defense, was intimately involved in the preparations for this impending slaughter. As a key member of the Committee of Imperial Defense, he helped fortify the military apparatus that would soon send millions of young British men into the brutal meat grinder of the Western Front. The contradiction here is perhaps the most difficult aspect of Esher's legacy to digest. On a macro level, Esher viewed young men as mere statistics. They were resources to be deployed, managed, and ultimately sacrificed for the preservation of the empire and the monarchy. He influenced the structural decisions of a system that resulted in unimaginable bloodshed for an entire generation. Yet, on a micro level, he remained intensely, obsessively focused on the emotional and physical lives of a select few. He could casually sign off on military strategies that meant certain death for thousands of unknown soldiers, while simultaneously spending hours agonizing over the precise manipulative wording of a deeply emotional letter to a single favored young officer. This extreme compartmentalization is a chilling hallmark of unaccountable power. It is the ability to separate human beings into distinct categories, those who matter and those who do not. The millions of working-class men who would soon die in the muddy trenches of France were abstract concepts to the Viscount. But the privileged boys at Eton, the young handsome guardsmen in London, and his own flesh and blood, they were his personal property. They existed solely for his consumption and control. The system he built was a masterpiece of silent subjugation. It required no physical force. It relied entirely on the exploitation of societal structures, personal ambition, and the sacred bond of familial duty. He weaponized the very institutions that were supposed to build character and protect the vulnerable. He took the elite schools, the military hierarchy, and the family unit and turned them into instruments of his own hidden will. He moved through the highest levels of British society like a phantom, leaving no fingerprints on the official documents of state, but leaving deep, permanent scars on the psyches of those unlucky enough to catch his eye. The outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 shattered the grand Edwardian illusion. For millions of citizens across Europe, the conflict signaled the end of a golden age and the beginning of an unprecedented slaughter. The established order was collapsing in the mud of the trenches. Yet for Viscount Esher, the descent into global conflict did not represent a loss of control. Instead, it provided the ultimate chaotic landscape for the expansion of his invisible empire. When the guns began to fire across the continent, Esher did not seek a formal command in the British Expeditionary Force, nor did he take a public seat in the War Cabinet in London. True to his lifelong philosophy, he chose the shadows over the spotlight. He positioned himself in France, adopting the somewhat vague, unassuming title of a liaison officer. Operating initially out of the Hotel Astoria in Paris, and later from a comfortable chateau, he became the most powerful unofficial diplomat in the entire theater of war. He systematically bypassed the formal British ambassador to France, Lord Bertie. Much to the ambassador's furious frustration, Esher communicated directly with the highest echelons of the French military and government. More importantly, he controlled the flow of highly sensitive information across the English Channel. He was the trusted confidant of Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, and he maintained a direct, unfiltered line of communication to King George V. Commanders in the field, including Sir John French and later Field Marshal Douglas Haig, relied heavily on Esher to interpret the shifting political moods in London. He was the grand interpreter of the war. He sat at the very nexus of military strategy and political survival. Yet, while his daily correspondence dealt with the movements of millions of troops and the fate of entire nations, his personal letters reveal that his dark, private compulsions never ceased. The war merely provided a new, desperate backdrop for his psychological machinations. The battlefields of the Western Front quickly became a meat grinder for the British aristocracy. Junior officers, drawn largely from the elite public schools like Eton, led the infantry charges over the top of the trenches. They suffered catastrophic casualty rates. These were not anonymous soldiers to Viscount Esher. These were the very boys he had carefully mentored. They were the young men he had flattered, manipulated, and drawn into his intricate web of patronage during his countless visits to the Eton dormitories. As the telegrams bearing news of their deaths flooded into London, historical records suggest that Esher's reaction was complex and deeply unsettling. Biographers and historians who have studied his wartime correspondence note a chilling emotional detachment masked by the grand, romanticized language of patriotic sacrifice. When a favored young officer fell in battle, Esher would write sweeping poetic tributes to their bravery. He elevated their deaths to the realm of Greek tragedy. He spoke of their glorious youth being offered upon the altar of the British Empire. However, many modern researchers argue that this highly stylized grief served a crucial psychological purpose for Esher. By wrapping their brutal, violent deaths in the noble language of imperial duty, he insulated himself from any sense of personal guilt. He had, after all, been a key architect of the military system that sent them into the machine gun fire. He had used his influence to place many of them in those exact frontline regiments, framing their slaughter as a beautiful, necessary sacrifice allowed him to maintain his self-image as a benevolent mentor, rather than acknowledging his complicity in a system that devoured the young. He consumed the tragedy of their deaths much like he consumed the intimate details of their lives from a safe distance, translating their visceral reality into a narrative that suited his own emotional needs. Throughout this period of unprecedented global trauma, his obsessive grip on his son Maurice remained unyielding. Maurice was serving in the military, eventually taking on roles in intelligence and the Provost Marshal's office in France. The chaos of a world war might have offered a young man a chance to break free from the suffocating influence of a manipulative parent. The constant threat of death often forces a reevaluation of familial bonds. But the vast archival trail of letters indicates that Esher's demands for intimacy and detailed reporting did not wane. Even while stationed in a war zone, surrounded by the physical and psychological devastation of combat, Maurice was still subjected to the overwhelming gravitational pull of his father's demands. Esher used his supreme influence within the military hierarchy not just to shape grand strategy, but to keep a constant watchful eye on his son. He knew exactly where Maurice was stationed. He knew who his commanding officers were, and he continued to write to him with the same intense, suffocating affection. Some historians have analyzed the tone of these wartime letters and pointed out a profound cognitive dissonance. In one paragraph, Esher might cold-bloodedly discuss the acceptable casualty numbers for an upcoming offensive at the Somme or Ypres. In the very next paragraph, he would transition to writing desperately to Maurice, begging for emotional validation and demanding intricate details of his son's daily interactions. He remained a man entirely divided. He was the cold, calculating servant of the crown on one hand, and a deeply needy, manipulative patriarch on the other. The tragedy for Maurice was that the war, rather than providing an escape, simply reinforced his father's absolute power. Esher was no longer just the man behind the king. He was a central pillar of the entire Allied war effort. To defy him, to refuse to write the letters, to finally establish psychological boundaries, would require an unimaginable act of rebellion. Maurice was trapped. He was caught between the literal warfare raging across the French countryside and the silent psychological warfare being waged through the Daily Post by his own father. This era highlights the terrifying resilience of systemic manipulation. Even as the old Edwardian world literally burned to the ground, destroying ancient empires and wiping out an entire generation of young men, Esher's personal system of control remained entirely intact. He adapted to the chaos. He used the war to consolidate his influence over the military establishment, while simultaneously using the heightened emotional stakes of the conflict to tighten his grip on the individuals he considered his personal property. He emerged from the bloodiest conflict in human history not only unscathed, but with his shadow power greater and more entrenched than ever before. The system had protected him in peacetime, and it proved just as effective at shielding him amidst the fires of war. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, the world that Reginald Brett had so meticulously manipulated was irrevocably broken. The British Empire emerged from the First World War victorious, but fundamentally hollowed out. A generation of young men, including the very boys Esher had mentored in the halls of Eton, lay buried in the sprawling cemeteries of France and Belgium. The old Edwardian certainty, the absolute belief in aristocratic superiority and divine imperial right, had been completely shattered by the mechanized slaughter of the trenches. In its place, a new, far more cynical and increasingly democratic society was beginning to take shape. For the first time in his life, the ultimate insider found himself standing on the outside of a rapidly changing cultural landscape. The transition from the immediate post-war years into the 1920s presented a unique crisis for Viscount Esher. His power had always relied on the quiet, unquestioned deference of the ruling class. He operated best in the hushed, velvet-lined corridors of palaces and the exclusive men-only smoking rooms of London clubs. But the political reality was shifting. The rise of the Labour Party, the expansion of the voting franchise to include millions of working-class men and women, and the growing influence of a loud, aggressive mass media meant that the era of the shadow puppeteer was drawing to a close. Decisions of state were increasingly being forced into the open, debated in Parliament rather than decided over a private dinner at Windsor Castle. Esher recognized this shift with the cold, analytical clarity that had always defined his career. He understood that he could no longer control the future in the way he had controlled the past. Instead, he made a deeply calculated decision. If he could no longer dictate the actions of the next generation, he would assert absolute control over how the previous generation would be remembered. He shifted his vast intellect and manipulative skills from the realm of active politics to the realm of historical preservation. He transitioned from being the architect of the empire to becoming its chief embalmer. This objective perfectly aligned with his long-standing role as the keeper of the royal archives and the editor of Queen Victoria's extensive letters and journals. The British public, deeply traumatized by the war, was beginning to look back at the Victorian and Edwardian eras with a potent mix of nostalgia and rising skepticism. Esher recognized the danger. If the unfiltered truth of how the ruling class had operated, their massive hypocrisies, their private scandals, and the staggering arrogance that had led to the war were to be exposed, it could fatally undermine the surviving institutions of the establishment. Therefore, Esher embarked on a monumental campaign of historical sanitation. He did not merely organize the royal archives, he actively curated them, wielding his editorial pen like a scalpel. He excised any passages that hinted at royal frailty, political backstabbing, or moral ambiguity. He shaped the historical record to present the monarchy and the aristocratic elite as paragons of duty, wisdom, and flawless Christian virtue. He was building a grand, impenetrable mythology. He wanted to ensure that when future historians looked back at his era, they would see only marble statues entirely stripped of their human flaws and darker compulsions. But this massive editorial undertaking was not solely about protecting the crown. Many historians argue that it was also an act of profound self-preservation. Esher was acutely aware of his own vast paper trail. He had spent decades writing highly compromising, deeply manipulative letters to military men, politicians, and young boys. By controlling the official historical narrative of the era, he was simultaneously constructing a protective vault around his own legacy. He relied on the deeply ingrained code of silence among the surviving elite. They all knew each other's secrets, and they all understood that exposing Esher would mean exposing the entire rotten foundation of their social class. He banked on the assumption that if the official history was clean, no one would dare look for the dirt beneath the floorboards. Yet, while he successfully sanitized the grand historical narrative, he could not erase the psychological wreckage he left in his immediate private sphere. The post-war years were particularly devastating for his son Maurice. Maurice had survived the conflict in France, returning home to a country trying desperately to forget the trauma. But for Maurice, there was no escape, because his trauma was not confined to the battlefield. The war had ended, but the psychological occupation by his father continued unabated. The tragic reality of Maurice's later life illustrates the terrifying permanence of Esher's manipulative control. Even as Maurice entered middle age, an era when most men have firmly established their own independent lives and families, he remained tethered to his father's obsessive demands. The letters between them continued, though some researchers note a shift in their tone. The frantic, desperate energy of Esher's earlier letters began to slowly curdle into something colder and more demanding. As Esher aged and his physical mobility decreased, his reliance on Maurice to provide him with vicarious experiences through written accounts seemed to intensify. It is difficult to fully comprehend the profound exhaustion Maurice must have felt. He had been denied the fundamental human right to psychological autonomy. He was never allowed to fully own his own romantic or personal life. Every intimate connection he made was ultimately filtered through the demanding voyeuristic lens of his father. We see the long-term effects of a parent using a child as an emotional proxy. It creates a state of arrested development. Maurice was trapped in a perpetual performance, a lifelong actor in a private play directed entirely by Reginald Brett. As the 1920s progressed, Esher's physical health began to slowly decline. He spent less time in the bustling heart of London and more time at his country estates or seeking warmer climates in Scotland and abroad. However, his physical absence from the capital did not immediately sever his connection to power. King George V, who deeply distrusted the rapidly changing modern world, continued to rely heavily on Esher's counsel. The king viewed Esher as one of the last remaining links to the solid, dependable era of his father and grandmother. Through frequent letters and private meetings, Esher continued to advise the monarch on everything from political appointments to the proper behavior of the younger royal princes. But the nature of this power was fundamentally different. It was no longer the dynamic world-shaping influence he had wielded at the turn of the century. It was the influence of a ghost. He was advising the king on how to preserve an institution in a world that was rapidly learning to live without deference. The powerful committees he once dominated were being replaced by public inquiries. The young men he had groomed and placed into high office were either dead in the fields of Flanders, or they had grown into disillusioned men who no longer needed or wanted his suffocating patronage. The ultimate paradox of Viscount Esher's final years was the isolation that accompanied his absolute control. He had spent a lifetime treating human beings as pieces on a chessboard, strategically moving them to satisfy his political ambitions and his dark private compulsions. He had avoided public scrutiny, evaded scandal, and dictated the moral laws of an empire. But a life spent entirely in the shadows eventually leaves you entirely alone. He had built a fortress of secrets, but as his era faded, that fortress slowly transformed into a prison of his own making. The world outside was moving on, completely unaware of the dark orchestrations of the man who had silently defined their century. The shadow of the Russian Revolution sent a terrifying chill through the halls of Buckingham Palace. By the early 1920s, the grand imperial families of Europe, the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, had been violently swept away, their ancient thrones replaced by firing squads and republics. King George V looked across the continent and saw the very real possibility of his own dynasty's extinction. The British working classes were striking, socialist movements were gaining unprecedented momentum, and the old deference to aristocratic bloodlines was rapidly evaporating in the harsh economic reality of the post-war years. The monarchy was in profound peril. To survive this democratic onslaught, King George needed a radical reinvention. He needed a master strategist who could rebuild the royal image from the ground up. He turned, as he always did, to the aging but intellectually formidable Viscount Esher. It was during this precarious period that Esher executed what is perhaps his most enduring and most deeply hypocritical masterpiece of public relations. He recognized that the survival of the House of Windsor depended entirely on its ability to project an image of absolute, unassailable moral purity and domestic normalcy. The days of Edwardian extravagance and aristocratic scandal had to be decisively buried. Esher instructed King George to become the living embodiment of the ultimate respectable British father. The monarchy was to be rebranded not as a distant, divinely appointed institution, but as the premier family of the nation, austere, dutiful, and aggressively traditional. He advised the king to cultivate a public persona of strict Christian morality, emphasizing duty, quiet domesticity, and unwavering fidelity. Every public appearance, every royal broadcast, every photograph was meticulously calibrated under Esher's indirect guidance to broadcast a message of safe, reassuring stability to the British public. The king was to be seen as a man of simple tastes, a loving husband to Queen Mary, and a stern but fair patriarch. Esher was essentially writing the foundational script for the modern British monarchy, a script that the royal family continues to rely upon over a century later. The historical irony of this campaign is staggering. The man relentlessly dictating the terms of this pristine traditional family model was simultaneously living a private life that subverted every single one of those values. Esher was constructing a monolithic monument to the traditional family, all while treating his own family as an experimental theater for his hidden compulsions. To maintain this impenetrable dual existence, Esher leaned heavily on the silent, structural complicity of his wife Eleanor. To the outside world, and particularly to the king, Eleanor van de Vere was the perfect Viscountess. She was the devoted mother, the elegant hostess, and the steady anchor of the Brett family. She provided Esher with the ultimate camouflage. However, historians remain deeply divided on the extent of her knowledge regarding her husband's activities. Some suggest she was a product of her era, willfully blind to the transgressions of powerful men, choosing the comfort and status of her title over the agonizing reality of her marriage. Others argue that the sheer scale of Esher's obsession with his son and his young protégés at Eton must have been impossible to entirely ignore. Regardless of what she knew, her presence functioned perfectly for Esher's survival. She was the living proof of his conventionality, a shield he held up against the judging eyes of the empire. While Esher was successfully managing the public image of the king, he was simultaneously navigating a significant crisis in his private realm. His son Maurice, the best beloved target of his lifelong psychological manipulation, was growing older. The dynamic of control that Esher had perfected when Maurice was a vulnerable youth and a young soldier in the trenches was inevitably challenged by the passage of time. Maurice eventually married a highly successful and famous actress, Zina Dare. For a man like Esher, whose control over his son relied on maintaining an exclusive, almost suffocating emotional monopoly, this marriage introduced an unpredictable and potentially threatening variable. To the public eye, Maurice Brett appeared to eventually escape his father's suffocating shadow. He forged a successful decorated military career and married the celebrated Edwardian actress, Zina Dare. It looked like the triumph of an independent man establishing his own legacy. However, surviving correspondences reveal a darker, more insidious reality. For a man like Esher, his son's marriage was not a loss of control. It was simply a new variable to manage. Esher did not destroy Maurice's adult life. He absorbed it. He utilized his vast wealth and unparalleled social influence to ensure the couple remained entirely within his gravitational pull. The relentless letters did not cease. They merely changed their focus. Esher integrated them into his sprawling network of royal acquaintances, positioning himself as the indispensable benevolent patriarch. He ensured that no matter how successful Maurice became, he could never truly establish a psychological boundary. Maurice was a decorated soldier and a family man, yet the historical record paints a chilling picture. Even in his own home, he remained a captive audience to his father's overarching ego. The ultimate tragedy is that Esher faced absolutely no consequences for this lifetime of emotional exploitation. The system he helped to build was remarkably efficient at protecting its architects. The political establishment, the military hierarchy, and the royal court were fully aware of Esher's eccentricities and his intense focus on young men. Yet a profound code of silence governed the upper echelons of British society. So long as a man of power did not cause a public scandal, did not end up in the police courts, and continued to provide valuable service to the state, his private sins were ignored. Esher was deemed too vital to fail. He possessed the secrets of the dead and the vulnerabilities of the living. He knew exactly how the king had reacted during the darkest days of the war. He knew the private failings of the prime ministers he had advised. To expose Esher's deeply disturbing relationship with his son, or to investigate his historical activities within the closed community of Eton College, would be to pull a thread that could unravel the entire tapestry of the British establishment. He was the keeper of the empire's darkest truths, and therefore his own dark truths were granted absolute immunity. He had successfully manipulated his way into a position of total unaccountability, proving that At the very heights of power, morality is often nothing more than a weapon used to control the masses, completely ignored by the men who forge it. As the twilight of the 1920s settled over Britain, Viscount Esher found himself increasingly confined to the quiet isolation of his Scottish estate Roman camp. His physical health was slowly failing, and the formidable intellect that had once orchestrated the movements of kings and generals was now largely focused on the meticulous organization of his own legacy. The political landscape of London had fundamentally shifted. The new generation of politicians, hardened by the Great War and driven by the rapid expansion of democratic ideals, had little use for the shadowy, unelected influence of a Victorian courtier. Esher recognized that his era of active manipulation had drawn to a close, yet he approached his final days not with the anxiety of a man fearing exposure, but with the calm certainty of an architect admiring a completed impenetrable fortress. By the time Viscount Esher retreated to the isolation of his Scottish estate in the late 1920s, his ultimate masterpiece was complete. He had successfully engineered the survival of the Windsor dynasty, transforming King George V into the unassailable symbol of strict Christian morality. But this was not just an act of public service. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation. The austere, fiercely traditional royal image Esher had meticulously crafted became his impenetrable shield. As long as the monarchy projected flawless virtue to a traumatized post-war public, the architect behind the curtain remained perfectly insulated from scrutiny. He used the pristine reputation of the crown to effectively launder his own dark legacy. When Reginald Brett died peacefully on January 22, 1930, there was no scandalous downfall. The establishment closed ranks, and official tributes painted a marble statue of immaculate statecraft. It was only decades later, when the unedited private archives were finally breached, that the marble crumbled. The records revealed the perfect moral crime. Viscount Esher successfully ran out the clock, leaving behind a legacy that shaped the destiny of an empire, built quietly upon the psychological ruins of those closest to him.